What's going on, everybody, and welcome to technically episode 107 of the Book Binge, even though that's not when this is coming out. This is actually coming out in place of episode 103. A slight delay on some things caused me to have to, switch around when episode 103 was coming out, even though I had already recorded it, and it would have been a waste to just re-record the entire thing, or re-record even just the intro to change the episode number because it was already recorded and edited and uploaded. So, it just made more sense to just record what was going to be coming out in the place of episode 107 and just put it out here because it's not time related and have the other one come out later. So that's just kind of how things are. This is episode 107, even though it's coming out in place of 103. This week, we're talking about Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. This book has been a long time coming for me, just kind of as a reader from a sort of conceptual perception, I suppose I can put it. I did get to read it a lot sooner than I thought I would, though a lot of that is because I forced to read along with some friends so that I could get to it as soon as I, even wanted to, or as soon as I had even just partially an opening. But yeah, I have a little bit of a background with this book related to my channel name Origins. Now, I know you might be thinking, I've had several questions in the past. People question me about, you're King Crusoe, but you haven't read Robinson Crusoe? What is this about? Nothing really specific. My name actually came from somewhere related to this book, but pretty indirectly. It's a little bit of a longer story than I'm going to summarize here, but I do want to, give the story now just because it's sort of fun. My name originated from the fact that my first name is not a name that I particularly enjoy. I don't really like being called it, and I don't like people, using it with me unless I know them very well. And even then, I only let certain people use my first name with me. It's just not what I go by. I go by my middle name. That's how it goes. Or online, I go by Casey, so that doesn't matter. Either way, my first name is not one I enjoy, but I always wanted to change my first name to Daniel. And then at some point in time, that Daniel, evolved to various different versions of the name, and then it eventually became Daniel Defoe. I don't know how or why that became the nickname. It just became the nickname. Again, I don't really have a straight-up explanation for how it became that. It just did. And that was my nickname online for a while. But then I came across this book and learned that Daniel Defoe was actually an author who wrote Robinson Crusoe. I didn't know this when I came up with my name. I thought that was pretty neat. It was just kind of like a fun fact related to my nickname or my, online persona, I suppose. And I continued to go by Daniel Defoe for even a few years after that, and then eventually shifted to doing YouTube and online stuff, and I still kept the name like that for a little bit, just because I didn't really have anything better to do with it, and even if it didn't make sense, it was just kind of how it went, I suppose I should say. But in regards to the name, my online persona was basically Daniel Defoe 23. I know there was an underscore in there somewhere, but I can't remember if it was in between the Daniel and the Defoe or before the 23 or whatever. But that was basically my nickname. But having that be my username online didn't necessarily jive for whatever reason. It just didn't flow. It didn't fit. At one point, I decided to make a little personal Discord server, and I nicknamed myself King of the Isle, or No, I didn't call myself King of the Isle. That's what I call myself now as a joke, playing on the King Crusoe side of things. But I called myself King Crusoe as a joke, as my nickname, as the owner of that little tiny Discord server at the time, because of this book, because my nickname was Daniel Defoe, and Daniel Defoe wrote Robinson Crusoe. I'm the king of the server, King Crusoe. It was just kind of a joke, and it really clicked, and eventually I was like, that's a much better name than Daniel Defoe 23, so I changed everything to King Crusoe. And that's how it's been to this day. So now let's actually get into the book itself, because this is a book review. This isn't a channel name origins video. I could, clip out that little section of the video and put it into a separate video to have as a channel introduction thing. But again, I digress. The good of Robinson Crusoe really comes down to the fact that it holds up as a novel from 300 years ago, as one of the oldest progenitors, I think that's the word, as one of the progenitors of the novel, essentially, in English literature, it is a book that holds up a lot better than I would have figured it did. I went into this expecting it to be either really bad, really rough around the edges, really boring, and or really hard to read. Any of those things could have been the description of how I expected this book to turn out for me upon reading it. But it turns out to hold up quite well, most particularly where the inner machinations of man are, concerned. It's really fascinating going through the character Robinson Crusoe's thought process of how he kind of lives through his life and how he does things and how he develops his life further given different periods of time after he crash lands on an island. And it's not really a spoiler to say, if you don't know that that's the basic concept of Robinson Crusoe, I don't know what to tell you. The journey that Robinson Crusoe takes is very enjoyable to follow and surprisingly readable as well. I know some people amongst my friend group find the term readable to be rather PTSD inducing, but that's an inside joke. It is surprisingly readable because of its age. Even when there's not much new happening on the page, it is still interesting to follow, and the prose is decent enough for a book this old, even if the spellings of some words are a little bit different, and if some sentences are structured a little bit differently than we would structure them today. It still kind of holds up in a writing perspective. Just being in the mind of the character is also an inherent source of enjoyment. There's something about his thought process that is just enjoyable to read through for the most part. The writing is a bit dry, but the thought process is always there and is always intriguing, but Defoe also knows that there isn't really that much new happening on a day-to-day basis within the novel. So there are many points in time where there's just years pass into sentence because nothing new is happening. He only writes down the portion of the book where it's like, okay, well, part of the living process, part of the life cycle, essentially, of Robinson Crusoe on this island has changed, has shifted. He's noticed something new. He's learning something new. He's doing something different. Let's talk about that. Let's have him record those thoughts rather than just, having it be the exact same thing happening every day for however many pages when it's pointless. So Defoe cuts out a lot of the pointless repetition. So there's a little bit of it that feels repetitive, but the actually pointless repetition isn't in there because it's a brief book. My copy of the book is only like 220 something pages. It takes a little bit longer to read than, say, your normal novel from today because of its age, but it is a rather brief novel, and that really helps it as well. The bad of Robinson Crusoe comes down to a point that I did mention briefly. It is a tad bit dry. That is absolutely true. But are you really surprised to learn that about a book that is 300 years old? There are moments where things are sort of repeated, most notably because the first however many pages, let me see, I think it's like 40 pages, is it 50? I'm not entirely sure. Yeah, right around the first 50 pages of my edition, up until you get to the journal, is a introduction into Robinson Crusoe as a character, sort of his upbringing, his past, his history, and then a little bit of a synopsis of some of the stuff that happened on the island, including a little bit on the very beginning, and then a couple brief mentions of things that happened throughout. So in some sense, tiny portions of the story are kind of spoiled by this 50 pages. It's like an introduction of sorts before it gets to the journal and then on through the rest of the book, where it's more of the focused storytelling of what happens. Crusoe does gloss over a lot of that very basic story in the first fifth, like I said, and then he starts kind of again from the moment of the shipwreck, essentially, the moment that he crashes on the island with certain portions of the journal and moves on, but it's a little bit more detailed, so it's still not horribly repetitive. It's not the exact same thing. It's a little bit more detailed, so there is that. And as a result of all of what I just mentioned, the structure of it is just slightly off because of that first 50 pages, and then it goes into what it's doing, repeating a little bit of stuff occasionally. But overall, the book holds up, like I said, for being as old as it is. The story ends in a rather strange place. You actually get to a point where, spoiler alert, Crusoe leaves the island, and the material that happens afterwards is surprisingly deep, but also kind of ends right in the middle of what's happening. It's kind of strange, and part of this is also exacerbated by the fact that pretty much on the very last page, says something along the lines of, oh, there's more to this story, perhaps I'll write more about it later, and then it just kind of stops. And as far as I know, there's not any sequels. If there's any sequels to Robinson Crusoe's story, I don't know if Daniel Defoe wrote them, nor do I know any of the quality of it, but it is kind of strange. Like, let me give you just a little bit of a snippet of the last sentence, which is basically the last paragraph of Robinson Crusoe, but only a little bit of the sentence, so I'm not technically spoiling anything. All these things with some very surprising incidents in some new adventures of my own, for 10 years more I may perhaps give a farther account of hereafter. And that's how the book ends. It's kind of strange. It ends in a strange place. Even though, the final moments of the book after the, escape from the island, essentially, as I'll put it, is really cool. Like, it's really neat. I would have liked to see a little bit more of that go on. It would have been nice to have, like, a second, part, essentially, of the book where, after the island was explored a little bit. I think that would have been really neat. So it is kind of strange that it ends there, but, it kind of is what it is. It was a pretty early novel, so I don't think, typical structures for how to plot things were necessarily super well known or super common or super widely utilized, I suppose I should say. The ugly of Robinson Crusoe. Just be aware, like I've mentioned multiple times, this book is 300 years old as well, though, and does sort of mention some slightly outdated things, but nothing too crazy, especially nothing that anybody who knows anything about history wouldn't already be familiar with to some degree. He's never utilized in anything that's like super egregious or unreadable, I suppose. It's just slightly outdated is basically how I'll put it. So in terms of the recommendation, I would say give Robinson Crusoe a shot. When the story finally straight up says the journal, like I said, right around page 50 in my edition, so it's like just a little under a quarter of the way through, so probably right around 23%, I would say. All that stuff starts is the cutoff point for your test run. If you enjoyed enough what you read in those first 50 pages, read the whole thing. If you just don't care at all, it can be a pass for you, and that's perfectly fine. Its age also makes it a little bit tougher to actively read, as I also briefly mentioned earlier. English was a little bit different back then, so it might take a little bit longer, a little bit more thought to process, but generally speaking, it is surprisingly readable for that age. It's much smoother than I personally thought it was going to be going into the book. But yeah, that is the review and a sort of synopsis of the origins of my channel name. I hope you enjoyed this video if you did. My next video on the channel is going to be something a little bit different, going back to a discussion that I recorded a couple months back with Jonathan from Words in Time, talking about sci-fi, basically some rapid-fire science fiction recommendations based off of things within Sun Eater that I enjoy, like philosophy or battles or whatever the case may be. So that video is another half-hour-long one coming out on Thursday. I hope you're excited for that one, because I am. The first one did really well. I got quite the reaction. I think it's my most watched video on the channel at all, so that's something that's pretty neat to see. So thank you guys again for watching. I'll be back in the next video.